This is the last session of the day, not the least. Let me move my slides. Oh, sorry. There we go. So it's again my pleasure to welcome to the stage our co-host, Dr. Larissa Nogueira, Team Lead of Energy Planning and Modeling at the ARENA. And this final session will be a little bit different. They'll address a very important topic around economic efficiency and political acceptability. So please join me in welcoming Larissa and our guest to the stage.
Thank you, Edward. So last push, guys, bear with us. And yeah, so we have a very interesting discussion today. We will discuss economic and social implications of the energy transition, focusing on affordability, energy poverty, and consumer impacts. So I will stop here with the description because I want to make room for the great panelists here. And yeah, so we start with Mark Purdon. So Dr. Mark Purdon is a professor at the Department of Strategy, Social and Environmental Responsibility at ESG UCAM since 2018, where he has held the chair in decarbonization since 2021. He is an expert in the emerging field of comparative climate change politics, focusing on the relationship between decarbonization and political economy. He earned a PhD in political science at the University of Toronto and has recently published a book with Oxford University entitled The Political Economy of Climate Finance Effectiveness in Developing Countries, Carbon Markets, Climate Funds, and the States. So please, Mark, come forward.
Great. And how do I advance? This, okay. Great. Well, I should have been in the MBA. What am I doing? Hi, my name's Mark Purdon. So thank you. I guess you can't see the title of our talk. Oh, here we can. So I'm a political scientist. I'm interested in the role that models play in the decision-making process. This paper, it's under review, Planning, Capacity, and Governance Authority for decarbonizing metro regional transportation in comparison of California, Quebec, which is a bit of a, well, I'll try and justify that comparison, but there's a lot of other people involved. I know the paper is co-authored with Mark Winfield and Florence Polyak, but there have been some others. I think Mark is in the room, and I'm sure you know, are familiar with him. But I guess just what we're doing in this paper is trying to understand, especially it's an investigation into this policy experiment that's been going on in California to decarbonize metropolitan regional transportation. So when we're talking about transportation, a lot of times we had just a session on Toronto and decarbonizing the city of Toronto. But when we look at transportation, we know that cities have suburbs, and these kind of suburban, kind of urban landscapes are where transportation is really a challenge. So when we talk about cities, that tends to, in geographical terms, really means the city cores. And the transportation issues, when we're talking about cars and suburbs linking transportation, that regional perspective, it's a bit more of a challenge. And California has sort of embarked on tackling this, and they adopted in 2008 something called the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. And there's some, it's starting to make some waves. If some of you are familiar with the Canada Public Transit Fund, there is, in a way, it replicates some of this SB 375. That's how it's referred to in California. And what's important about what's happening in California is it's really, and this is, I think, the link with what you're interested in, is institutionalize the role of modeling in the planning process, in the regional transportation planning process in California. And so this kind of speaks to larger issues of what roles do models play in the decision-making process, and that's where the politics enters, right? So you have a lot of modeling tools, but maybe nobody's looking at them, or sometimes the models are used to justify decisions that are already made, and the models can also be manipulated, right? If you know how they work, you can, not the modelers themselves, but you can invest in the models that give you the results you want. So it's just interesting to kind of step back and look at the role of modeling in the decision-making process. And so I'll give you some background, though, and we have to kind of step back and see about regional air pollution and transportation planning in the United States. So United States, they have, in 1962, they had federal legislation, and they created something that are called metropolitan planning organizations. And these were to help large metropolitan regions to develop, to plan for transportation. Originally highways, but now that's gotten more broad. So the key issue here is these regional transportation plans that are developed every 5 years, which define transportation investments over the next 20 years. And the federal government is like, if you want money from us, then you have to do these plans, right? So there's an incentive for these regional organizations. And so you have these MPOs, and they cover, well, in the case of Southern California, it covers Los Angeles County and 4 other counties. It's an immense territory. I mean, it's like, I think it's got 18 million people, so it's like half of Canada in one of these organizations. But there's a real important role for transport system modeling in these things, in these air pollution planning schemes. And what California has done is grafted on greenhouse gas emission reduction targets onto that federal framework. Okay, so there's this air pollution framework. If you wanted money to expand your highways or some sort of public transit from the federal government, you had to demonstrate your transportation plan was going to meet regional green ambient air pollution targets, and then California has introduced greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in the transportation sector, and these are called regional plan climate targets. It's pretty innovative, and there's a lot of questions if this is really working, but essentially by 18 MPOs across California, currently have a plan, well, this is a bit dated, 19.6 by 2020 reduction, but 18% reduction by 2035 relative to 2005 levels. And they're really trying to target the transportation sector, vehicle travel. And the special plan you have to produce in this context is something called the Sustainable Community Strategy. And again, modeling plays an important role in this. So just maybe, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's a number of roles, steps in the modeling, in the policy process. You have baseline conditions, target year, transport supply analysis, some kind of forecast model analysis, and then there's some outcomes, and you can understand if there's going to be emission reductions associated with these types of investments, transportation investments. And if it doesn't work, well, you have to go back to the drawing board. And this is institutionalized. This is legally mandated, okay? So if you don't have a good plan in the Los Angeles metropolitan region, people can sue you, right? That regional organization. So it's an interesting role for modeling in the decision-making process. But there's questions as to whether it's working. The performance of these plans under SB 375, the latest updates are suggesting it's not really reining in emissions in the transportation sector. So what's going wrong? So this is where our research comes in, and we did interviews via Zoom largely with modelers and transportation policy experts in the LA region and in the Montreal region. We had this research project going on where we were looking at partnerships and relationships between California, Quebec, and Ontario. Quebec and Ontario have the carbon market. So there's some natural kind of relations that seem interesting to explore. So we did these interviews. That's a lot of what the research here is based on. I'm just really going to provide you details on what we found in California and then kind of relate them to a summary of what we saw in Montreal. But our analytical framework, one of the challenging things of all this is when you're looking at the role of modeling in the planning and governance process, it gets actually very complex. So a lot of the emphasis today is about on modeling capacity, and we can say that's a subgroup of planning capacity. If you're a planner, models play a large role, but there's something we can talk about called administrative capacity. But then when we looked at the governance challenges in California, where's the financing going to come from for these transportation? Is the federal government going to provide it all? Is the state government What about the local governments, okay? And then an even bigger challenge for transportation in the United States, well, and a little less so in Quebec and Canada, is authority over land use, okay? So there's sort of a vast spectrum. When you're thinking about how you're gonna be, your modeling results are gonna be implemented, you're gonna have to start kind of looking at the authority issues that are there. And what we found out is that when you get into these authority questions of whether a plan is going to be executed that you've modeled, it gets very, very complex, because there's things of delegated authority in the United States, which means that there's all sorts of ad hoc rules that are not kind of transparent until you start digging. A best example is Proposition 13 in California, which is a ballot measure adopted in the 1970s, which freezes taxation in the land use sector. So there's a huge constitutional obstacle to land use in California. And that's, you have to kind of get into the weeds really to understand where these governance challenges arise. Anyway, getting back to so this MPO in Southern California is called SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments. It's a terrible acronym. But they produced in 2020 their Sustainable Community Strategy. And it was a plan that they did a lot of workshopping, roundtables, and they were able to identify a number of measures that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector 19% below the 2005 levels, so they're meeting the target. They had really great models. So some of you are into transportation and urban research and modeling. Urban footprint model was pretty up to very well known, and they also had a new activity-based transportation model. So really, really cutting-edge models being used by SCAG. But the main problem is SCAG has limited financial capacity, and they just aren't really getting sufficient funding from the federal government, even if they produce these plans. So one kind of quote here is SCAG can dream big, but they don't have the power and authority and the means to implement. They can't get the funding, sufficient funding to implement their plans. So they develop these very, very cutting-edge plans, but they can't implement them because they don't have the resources. And MPOs like SCAG in California are very aware of this, and they've actually complained to the state government that, you know, you're making us implement all these crazy plans, but we don't have the resources to execute them. So, you know, give us more money, do your job. At the same time, it gets complex. You have the Southern California Association of Governments, that MPO, but there's other actors. There's LA County. LA County is huge. LA County has about 10 million people, okay? And that's not the city, right? There's the city of Los Angeles, which is part of LA County. Anyway, to make a long story short, they have special rules to introduce a sales tax for public transport. So LA County was generating a lot of revenue to expand the metro system in Los Angeles County, which is maybe a third of that metropolitan planning organization's full area. And they were kind of going ahead with a lot of investments into the public transit in LA County. So it kind of complicates things. I'm going to kind of get to the real challenge, though, in California is over land use. Land use authority resides with local governments, okay? So that's the city of Los Angeles, but it's also things like Compton and Bel Air and Hollywood, okay? Things you've heard about. And people in these rich parts of LA, they don't want to have dense housing developments where they're sort of, you know, if you're in Beverly Hills, you don't want to have sort of a multi-story low-income housing project next to you. Creates all sorts of political pushback. So California has a lot of problems implementing transportation policies because of the authority invested in local governments. And there's a whole, you know, there's all sorts of injustices rolled into here that need to be unpacked, and they're working on this. I also highlight Proposition 13, which I mentioned, which creates a whole set of other perversions in how financial incentives for developing low-income housing. It's really quite scandalous when you get into the details. So coming back, I'm not going to kind of dwell on the details of what we saw in Montreal and Quebec. But essentially, what we saw is that the modeling capacity in LA region and the administrative capacity were well beyond. We don't have anything like this in Quebec and in Montreal. A lower capacity, the modeling capacity is being developed, but there's the institutional requirements for the use of modeling really are absent. And there's some questions about the funding in Quebec. There's this new Canadian Public Transit Fund that I mentioned. But the advantage that the Quebec has and that most Canadian provinces have is over land use. And so Quebec is trying to push ahead with greater densification standards for the metropolitan region in a way that the California government can't do. So there's some opportunities there because more dense metropolitan regions improves the chances for transportation. So to conclude, we see that there's, when people are interested in sort of cities and this bottom-up kind of approach to climate governance, well, it gets complicated because cities have different delegated authorities, and we see the state and provincial and federal governments playing a role, an important role. But this is really complex. It gets very complex when you start looking at how delegated authority differs in different states and provinces in the different US and Canadian federal jurisdictions. But the California example suggests that you can depoliticize the planning process by institutionalizing modeling. But there are these challenges over land use that frustrate implementation. In Quebec, we have an absence of the equivalent to an MPO process. There's something called the Metropolitan Community of Montreal, but they don't really have that institutional and a weight behind them. Transportation investments still largely controlled by the provincial government. And the provincial government, if they want, though, they could probably impose greater densification targets and drive for greater decarbonization there. So that's about all I have. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mark. Right on time. So our next speaker is, I'm going to have a problem with this, with the difference of heights. Elizaveta Kuznetsova. So Elizaveta is the head of energy value chains at ESMIA. She leads projects exploring the economic transformations required by policies aimed at achieving net zero targets, focusing on energy supply chains, stranded asset costs, energy rates, consumer bills, jobs, and just transitions. With this work, she has been supporting federal and provincial governments using modeling results to inform decision-making. So, please.
Thank you, Larissa. Okay, thank you everybody for staying with us so long. I will try to make it entertaining as possible. So we will talk about energy equity and the impact of energy transition it may have on it. We will start with some basics by defining what is energy poverty and equity. We'll talk about different factors that may impact household energy expenditures and how electricity rates and gas rates may evolve in the future. And finally, we'll see what may be the impact on energy expenses and equity from energy transition by 2050. So let's define what's the energy poverty and equity. So if energy burden measured in percentages surpass some defined threshold, we can say that household is energy poor. Energy burden is defined as a ratio of the dwelling energy bill on after-tax income. And here's some example of the threshold defined by Statistics of Canada of 10%. This is only related to the energy consumption in the building itself. There is no transportation here. So if you think you add the transportation, this threshold will increase a little bit. And on the right side, you can see the plot of energy burden by different income deciles for Canada. And let's see what is inequity is. So we can observe that there is a difference in energy burden inside the same income decile. In this case, we will talk about horizontal inequity. So basically, people with the same income will pay different levels of the energy bills. And vertical inequity is related to the difference of energy burden for households situated in different income deciles. So what we want from our energy transition and from the policy that will support this energy transition is not only to avoid the additional distortion in this base representation of the energy burden, but we would love to have some improvement of energy equity, both horizontal and vertical. So basically, we want not only energy transition to improve, decrease the emissions, improve reliability, but we also want to have a just transition. So a few words about factors that will affect energy expenditures for households. It's obviously dwelling sizes and energy efficiency of different homes. So for instance, envelopes, transportation mode, if our households have some cars, for instance, heating equipment, operational condition, and the fuel type they will use for heating homes. And here on the right, some representation of the split of fuels used to heating homes in Canada. So we have almost half and half gas and electricity, but electricity mostly used on the East Coast and the gas on the West Coast. And the heating oil and other fuels, the heating oils is mostly used in the territories. So other factors are weather and also prices that are associated with these fuels. So when we talk about prices, they in their turn will depend on a regulation, for example, in different jurisdictions, how costs are allocated among different consumer categories. Inventories, for example, for gas, it will be related to the amount of the gas stored for the winter, and if it will be sufficient depending on weather conditions. And the energy transition pathway that may be a bit different. For example, we may have more or less electrification. It may be focused on cleaner gases. So it may be defined based on a bit different strategies. From the perspective of the policy insight that I will try to give all along my slides, I think it will be good to think about energy transition that will be specific, customized for different jurisdictions and for the specific context. So now let's go to see how rates for gas, and we will start with gas, and electricity will evolve in the future. We will be looking on several scenarios. You can see there is a reference there and two net zeros. The one which is labeled with the ALC is focused mostly on electrification, and the bio focused on the increased use of biomass, so you will have more biofuels, biogases, renewable natural gas. So the trends you can observe here is that with the energy transition, you have a considerable increase in the rates that are specifically related to the service rates, so to the grids, the distribution, and potentially transmission. It will be more or less pronounced depending on scenario and a province. This is due to the fact that consumers, especially in the building, will electrify and will leave distribution grid to use more electricity, and the remaining consumers will basically support most of the costs of the existing infrastructure if we do not have some partial abandonment. So from the point of the policy insights, I want to amplify that yes, the customized energy transition for the specific jurisdiction is very important. And also important to think about the optimal planning of regulation for the partial distribution abandonment in case if we really need to go there. So we need to think about this in advance. Let's go to electricity. So here are the same scenarios and the same jurisdictions. I didn't tell it, but we're here showing Alberta and Ontario. What we can see is that the increase is not so drastic as we saw for gas, for instance, but we still see some considerable increase, especially, for example, here for Alberta. This is mostly related to the deployment of the additional capacity to address the increase in electrification, and you will notice in gray additional costs appears that actually related to reinforcement and the improvement of existing transmission and distribution. It takes about 10% of the future rates, but we think it may go even further. But here the problem is the data, so we'll try to refine it, but potentially this portion of cost may be higher. So what drives this increase? As I said, there's an increasing electrification, and if we talk about households, there is an important part related to the charging of the light-duty vehicles. So people will tend to switch more from gasoline cars to electric battery vehicles that will increase the electricity demand and also peaks. So we need this additional deployment. But at the same time, it may create the cross-subsidies across consumers. So people who do not have a private vehicle and will be not charging it will be paying partially the cost for people who actually will be responsible for additional deployment because they have electric vehicles and they will be charging it. So from the policy perspective, they could be important to think about a combination of measures to avoid these cross-subsidies across different consumers, so the impact of cost is distributed more fairly. Let's look now on the average expenses. I highlight here, this is an energy expenses of an average household. So just to show you total costs that are normalized by the number of households in each jurisdiction from now to 2050. So in general, what we see is the energy transition is actually having some positive impact. The average expenses tend to decrease, and this is due to the increase in energy efficiency and also decrease in consumption. So typically by switching from some conventional technologies to electric technologies, we gain in efficiency. We may decrease the consumption by retrofitting the building envelope and introducing more control measures. And we can also install distributed generation such as roof, solar, PV, so we can self-generate, self-consume, and decrease our consumption from the external grid. So from the policy perspective, it will be important to evaluate and to see what could be the support measures to improve affordability of all these techniques, let's say, to increase efficiency and decrease consumptions for different households. So now moving from the average household, let's see what will happen for different income deciles. Let's look on a figure here. So here it's for Ontario. We have our blue dots, which is energy burden by income decile in 2021. What happens if the household cannot actually invest to retrofit and control its energy use in a building? You see that the energy burden will increase. We have this shift to the right, which increases horizontal inequity, for instance. If our household cannot switch for some reasons from gas heating to electric heating, we have even further increase of the energy burden, which can happen for poor household who cannot, for example, afford to replace the furnace and will be needed to stay on it and not to implement a heat pump, for example. But what we want to have is something here moving to the left side. So the optimal energy switch that will be possible with the adapted support measures for different households in different income deciles. So talking about several factors that may increase vertical and horizontal inequity. So for vertical inequity, it could be a high investment costs that will be needed to retrofit, install distributed generation, invest in new heating technologies, and replace vehicles. If we're talking about horizontal inequity, so within the same income decile, this mainly will be some starting conditions for different households, meaning that already now we can have some households using gas, but others will be using electricity, and they will be differently affected by the changes in energy rates in the future. There is also an important factor here is landlords versus tenants, because it will be much more complicated for tenants to improve their energy efficiency and decrease their consumption if there is no specific regulation for landlords in place. So from the policy perspective, again, I think it's repeat a bit what I said before. It was very important to customize the support measures specifically for a household archetype portfolio in each jurisdiction, which includes both the income deciles, but also energy use and how this energy is used in a household. And one example on how the effect of landlords versus tenant may be handled. Just an example from France with energy performance diagnosis, where landlords cannot, for example, sell or rent their property if the energy performance rate is lower than the one defined in a regulation. And I'm ahead of time. So here are the key findings, which are basically very straightforward. So despite the increase in energy tariff, what we saw for gas and electricity here, the energy transition in general had a positive impact on the energy expenses for an average household in a jurisdiction. And this is primarily driven by the electrification, which will result in an increase in efficiency and decrease in energy consumption. However, if we do not have adapted support measures that are tailored to household archetypes in each jurisdiction, energy inequity both across different income deciles, but also within the same income decile will tend to increase. So without tailored support measures, we cannot ensure the just transition here. Thank you. This will be all for me.
Thank you, Elisabetta. Very, very interesting. So next we're going to hear Vaios Triantafylou. Hope I got it right. Vaios is a PhD candidate in economics at Cornell University, UK. He has an engineering background with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering and applied mechanics from Harvard University and a master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses primarily on the distributional effects on the green energy transition, examining the transitional costs for workers, as well as the environmental and economic impacts of critical mineral extractions. So Vaios will now present his research. And I think I got the country wrong. I'm sorry, it was US. Come in.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me today. So I'm basically going to present this work which examines the transitional costs that workers face during the green transition, and more specifically during phasing out power generation from coal. I'm going to be doing this in the context of Germany. I hope this is also relevant in other contexts, such as the Canadian one, where non-abated power generation from coal is said to be phased out by 2030. So, and also one more note is that this project is less model heavy. It's more of an applied microeconomics project where I'm basically estimating the effects on wages for workers. So one particular thing about Germany is that it has been traditionally more heavily dependent on coal, and as a result of that, the share of electricity in total emissions has been way larger than the average for the figures that are true in other countries. And this is primarily driven from coal. Since 2015 or so, we've seen a decline, as you can see there. And this is particularly driven by the very policy for coal phase out that I'm going to be talking about here. Historically, in Germany, there has been a very large coal mining industry. This was concentrated in what is broadly defined as Rhineland and central Germany and Lusatia, and this is very much spatially correlated with where the coal plants were actually built. What is particular about those regions is that we have higher degrees of unemployment higher rates, of unemployment than what we see in Germany overall, and it's also like studies show that workers in the supply chain of coal are usually less educated and older, and therefore might be facing larger transitional costs as we phase out coal and we replace with greener sources of energy. So I'm going to briefly describe the policy that I'm studying here. What happened is in 2014, essentially there was a public discussion that kicked off about the future of the electricity market in Germany. The Energy Industry Act was passed in 2016, and among other things, it stipulated, with respect to coal, it stipulated that 5 large lignite-fired plants are forced to go into a standby. This means basically that they need to keep a minimal amount of personnel. They cannot supply the grid, but then in case of an emergency or an imbalance in the supply and demand in the grid, they need to fire up and basically supply the grid again. And then a tendering process to close plants was announced for the future, where basically power producers would bid to take the plants offline. And then in that second stage, there were actually packages that would support the workers and affected regions at large, basically. However, between 2016 and 2019, until the first tender took place, we didn't have any packages for workers. There were some agreements, some payments that were made directly to the companies. These are confidential. And I got to present this at the Federal Network Agency in Germany, and I asked, were there any stipulations for workers, because it's important to know whether or not the effects that we're looking at here are in presence of support packages for workers or not. And these agreements are actually confidential. However, what I'm going to be doing in this paper is focusing on this 2016-2019 period, and basically try to quantify the hit that workers take in their wages, essentially, as a result of phasing out coal. After the announcement and the introduction of the official law, we had a 45% reduction in the power generated from coal. Part of that was driven by those 5 plants that had to go into the reserve. However, the bulk of it, almost 65% of the reduction, was from other plants that did not even receive any payments from the government. And what I want to understand in this project is how are workers affected by it? What happens? Do they lose their jobs? Where do they transition? So, in my empirical approach, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on those regions in Germany that contain either an operational plant or a plant that retired or went into the reserve during that period. I have a confidential data set of matched employer-employee data. What I can do in this data set is basically follow workers over time, see where they work each year, how much money they make, how many hours they work, what's their occupation, and I can follow them over time for the entire period from 2009 to 2019. Sorry, and to give you a bit of scope about the size of those areas, we have roughly 5.5 out of the total 40 million employees in Germany residing in those gray areas that I am focusing on. And essentially, what I'm doing is very simple. I'm comparing workers in the supply chain of coal. Actually, workers that work in electricity and mining in coal to workers outside of electricity, so to all other workers. And I'm basically trying to understand how, given that before the introduction of the legislation, the wages had been evolving in a similar rate, what was the effect of that legislation on the affected workers? So the baseline result that I'm going to show you is essentially and you can interpret these coefficients basically as a percentage change in the wages relative to the difference between the two groups at the baseline period. And we can see here I'm showing the average daily wage of workers, which dropped up to roughly 4% in 2018. And I'm also showing the total labor earnings, right? Because the first thing that I wanted to understand is this driven by a drop in the total earnings of workers, or is this driven by hours worked, right? And as you can see here, the effect is driven by a drop in the total labor earnings during a year, which basically brings me to the next question, which is who faced the largest reduction during that phase out, who were the people that were mostly affected. The first thing that I did is separate workers to what I call stayers and leavers. These are basically workers that stayed with the same companies, the same company that they used to work for before the legislation throughout the period of study. And leavers are those workers that essentially left the company at any point after the introduction of the legislation. You can see that there was a small negative effect that was not persistent for workers who stayed with the same company, but those who had to leave were actually the ones that faced the largest effect of up to 5% in labor earnings as a result of moving to a different company. And I'm going to dig a bit deeper about what that means and essentially what they did in that new company in a bit. So the next thing that I am looking at is, was there an effect on unemployment? So we see so far that there was a reduction in earnings. So it's important to understand whether or not, although we've established already this is not driven by a reduction in hours worked, it's important to understand whether or not workers actually went to unemployment. We can see that there was, and here what I'm doing is instead of looking at before and after 2014, which was the announcement, I'm normalizing around the period of the closure of the first plant to get more close to the, not to the effect of the legislation per se, but to the effect of the closure of the plant. And we can see that there's a negative effect in the first year after the legislation, after the closure of the plant, sorry, but this is not persistent, and in the long term, we do not essentially see any statistically significant effect on unemployment. So what we've established so far is that there is a reduction in total labor earnings that is not driven by hours worked. Those people who left from their firms and joined another firm are the ones who essentially were more disproportionately affected, but those workers did not go to unemployment, essentially. They remained employed. So the natural question is, where do workers transition? And what does that look like? So what I'm showing here, and I'm going to take a minute to explain this graph because it might be a bit confusing. This is the impact on the probability of separating from the company that you used to work for in the previous year. This probability that I'm showing here is the probability of moving to a different company within the same industry in the same district. I have the same graph for other combinations of this different industry, same district, different district, same industry, and so on. I'm not presenting it here in the interest of time and space. But what we see here is essentially in the second year after the closure of a plant, we see only an effect of people moving moving to a new firm within the same industry and within the same district. So there is no sort of sectoral reallocation of workers moving to different industries or sectors, and there is no mobility in the sense of workers moving to a different district, essentially. Next, what I did is I utilized what is known, several researchers in Germany essentially created what is known as the greenness of jobs index, where they use the tasks that are being carried out in several occupations in order to classify them as green or non-green. Actually, this is a continuous measure that goes from very green, less green, white, and then brown and very brown occupations. And what I see essentially is that those moves are to occupations that were essentially greener than the ones that they used to carry out before. And the story that I have in mind and what I see in the data is essentially that those new occupations, the new greener occupations, are essentially inherently different from the occupations that they used to do in a coal plant or a coal mine. So there was sort of a skill or a task mismatch between these occupations that essentially led to the reduction in earnings that we see as a result of this task mismatch. And a last thing that I want to note about this picture is that it might be strange that we see the transition taking place 2 years after the closure of a plant, but this is in line with German labor law, basically, where firms are obliged to give at least 2 years of notice to employees. And I'm just pointing this out because it was a bit strange to me when I first got the result, but it in fact does make sense. So in terms of the main takeaways of this project, phasing out coal-fired power generation does entail transitional costs for workers, so they can it can have an impact on their earnings. However, emerging green jobs can potentially mitigating the employment effects, right? So greener jobs that come up can mitigate the effects. However, a skill mismatch or a task mismatch between what the work is used to do in the old job and what they do in those new jobs that pop up, that might be, for example, installation of solar panels or wind turbines or something like that, can lead to foregone earnings for workers during this process. However, I mean, this is, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a case study of Germany. However, still more evidence is needed from different contexts. There is some work that is being done in the case of the UK, in the case of the US, but we still need more evidence to understand whether or not what what happened in Germany is actually the case and can be generalized and inform policy in other places as well. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vios. And before I introduce our next presenter, I want to motivate you guys to send your questions to Slido. And yes, so now let me introduce you to Dr. James Glynn is the founder and CEO of Energy Systems Modeling Analytics Limited in Ireland. ESMA, not ESMIA. ESMIA is Elisabetta. ESMA provides consulting services using advanced open energy systems models in the IEA at subtimes framework to enable partnerships to co-create data-driven decisions for optimal investments, engineering operations, strategic long-term planning, policy uncertainty, and risk mitigation analytics in clean energy futures. Previously, James was a senior research scholar at Columbia University, New York, and research fellow in University College Cork. So please, James.
So thank you all for still being awake. It's about, I don't know, 8 or 9 p.m. in my head. So thanks to Larissa, thanks to Irina and to EMH for the invitation to speak today. And I definitely don't have 32 seconds left. Also, I was talking to Madeleine at the break, and as far as I know from outside Canada, this is a really special and probably unique group of people. Having the modelling community and the policy group and stakeholders all in one room annually, I think is really special. So I think that's to be very sincerely, not mansplaining, congratulated. So well done. So I'm going to talk at a super high level, not about any specific papers or analysis, but just talking about my experiences over the last 15, 20 years working in energy systems modeling at the nuts and bolts, at technology development, and then coming up higher and higher into the into abstraction about how to actually communicate energy systems model results and use them in policy. So I'm going to focus on where I learned my trade in Ireland and then some applications of communicating these types of results in the EU, in COP21 in Paris and in New York over the last few years. So I sneakily updated my slides this morning. We talked a lot about different types of data pipelines and modeling processes. So, we have our data, we have our models, and we have our results. But another type of black box that we don't talk about is the interface between how do we communicate our results and to the actual individuals, the real people who write the laws or write the policy, and how do they actually interpret what you're saying. They're generally not engineers, they're generally not scientists, they're not mathematicians, usually they're lawyers or humanities, and they do not interpret data the way modelers create it. So I want to ask some kind of provocative questions about not just what is the uncertainty in our data inputs and our model structures, but what's the uncertainty induced by the absorptive capacity of policymakers to actually correctly interpret what you're saying. There's other institutional issues, like in Ireland, the civil service each individual person in the civil service move about every 6 months or every year, which means you have 6 months to communicate effectively really difficult problems. So again, structurally, what does that actually mean then for absorptive capacity? How does that ability to build relationships and build communication within government, how does that impact our energy transition? Does that have a bigger impact on construction lead times for a nuclear plant or permitting for transmission? Those are types of uncertainties that we're trying to think about in our process. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Ireland on the left. So just as I was starting my PhD, there was an extreme weather event. The centre of Cork, where our lab got flooded. It was quite motivating, moving cities, and that was the first few months there. I'm going to talk a little bit about experiences at the end of my PhD, presenting some initial work at COP21 about equitable finance globally, and then talking more about really difficult dialogue and really almost confrontational dialogue at Columbia, and the convening power at Columbia, bringing together people who do not really want to sit in the same room, but they should sit in the same room, and how can you use energy systems models to ground truth, difficult conversations and difficult dialogue. So if you want a nice summary of what I'm going to say over the next 4 or 5 slides, this is a really nice book chapter that was published by the IEA ETSAP by previous PhD mentor and now friends and colleagues, Bruno Gallagher, Paul Dean and Fionn Rogan. So it brings together about 20, maybe 15 years or 20 years of experience, starting out within the IEA ETSAP as a small academic modelling group in the south of Ireland, and really scrambling around in the dark about building these detailed models, coming, learning our modelling trade basically as kind of young PhD students, and then coming up through the international modelling scene, becoming more and more senior, and learning the modelling techniques, but then going beyond that and actually how do you communicate that to the individual policy makers. So actually developing the relationships with individual policymakers became one of the key things that we spent more and more time as we tried to inject our insights from our modelling into policy in Ireland. So I'm going to try and stay away from data and just talk again at a high level. So one thing that we did, we were using Irish models, using European models, using global models, and we found that this was really useful to have a global context within our national modelling. So because during my PhD I was using one of the global IEA ETSAP TM models, I was very much plugged into the integrated assessment modelling community and looking at what were consistent carbon budgets to stay well below 1.5 degrees, well before it was becoming European policy and certainly before it was becoming Irish policy. So we were able to get ahead of what policymakers' needs were by about 3 or 4 years, just following the science, doing the modelling, and then having the academic peer review papers published before the policymakers came to look for them. But then when they did come to look for them, we had them, the papers were already published, the models were already done, and what we had to do then was think about really how do we communicate those peer review papers to policymakers. So policymakers, one, again, as I said earlier, are not generally technically minded, and also they just don't have the time to read 20 peer-reviewed papers. So we worked through these methods of how do you actually develop a structured policy brief, distilling maybe 20 peer-reviewed papers down to like 3 or 4 pages that would actually be a policy brief for a minister. So this is our Irish energy minister at the time in 2019. It's his assistant secretary beside him at COP23 in Bonn, I believe. And this is something that we were particularly proud of at the time, that our policy brief is what he's reading off. It's not his government officials. It's 20 or maybe 10 years of academic research distilled down into a very detailed, a very specifically tuned document for him to absorb effectively. So that was, maybe up to 2019. But then we started to realize, well, that's only the policy interface. It's not really co-creation. It's academics talking about what we think might be the right direction to go for the energy transition and communicating academic peer-reviewed papers in a nice new way. but it's not taking into account from the grassroots, from the ground up, what communities, local cities, local towns, communities of practice, how do they think about the energy transition? And so we started to look at deliberative futures, looking at how do people literally dream or vision their futures, and how do you actually use energy systems model scenarios to interact and have dialogue and discussions and different ways of communicating, like literally sitting around a table for a weekend, drawing maps on your own town and what does that look like, and then feeding that as constraints and data into a model, iterating that, doing that over 2 or 3 weekends. It's something that we developed a method for, developed a toolbox, and it's all peer-reviewed and published. So please have a look at it. Yeah, that's all I want to say on that. The next thing then we started looking at was going beyond just the data, and the techno-economics, the actual interpretations of language and the context within which we communicate our results, a lot of the social norms, the narratives that go on within the shared socioeconomic pathways. I don't think we've really touched on it over the last 2 days. But things like religion, things like education, things like gender equity, things like empathy matter to the absorptive capacity of government and policymakers of why people make the decisions that they make. So we started to go far beyond techno-economics, but into deep institutional innovation for sustainable and human development. So really getting into kind of the edge of the modeling sphere, and how do you, pushing our comfort boundaries, getting into these types of areas. So this will hopefully be far more of an eloquent cheat sheet or list if you're trying to summarize what I'm saying from my Irish experience. And this is basically the takeaways from the book chapter. So I'm just going to read this out because it's far more succinct than I'm saying it in my sleep-deprived state. So if you want to really impact and have effective policy absorptive capacity within your country or within institutions or within stakeholders, undertake scientifically robust research, submit it for peer review, publish it in scientific journals, but make the data and the methods and results open and publicly available. So in our case, both our old Irish Times model and our new Times Ireland model was developed on GitHub. It was open. It was peer reviewed within the community in Ireland. The model is open. The data is all open. The dashboard that we use for our results is a website where people can iterate and look at it. So, and you can feel free to go have a look at it as well. Frame your research questions that are policy relevant and actually answering needs in the policy sphere. We don't have a lot of time, so reinventing the wheel, duplicating each other's work is a waste of our collective time. And then submit the results and insights to policy practitioners to inform their policy in ways that they will understand it rather than just peer-reviewed papers. So we were relatively successful in doing this, feeding in peer-reviewed papers, translating them into other documents that then fed into law, like the National Mitigation Plan in Ireland in 2017, our climate action law, which was, I think, the second globally to legislate for carbon budgets and is informed by our modelling. Transform or translate research results into policy insights. So again, convert your peer-reviewed papers into policy briefs. Really think about your communication and don't just publish papers, but having targeted infographics, having policy briefs for really senior ministers or executives. Don't just use one type of communication for all your stakeholders. Actively engage with policy practitioners and policy makers. It's really critical to move. That engagement is really important to move beyond influencing, but actually co-creating policy. Those really frequent meetings that happen sporadically are really important. That academia can really help inform policy. You have to be able to react quickly on a weekly timescale rather than on months that is typically academic timescale. We have to move towards co-creation of policy. We've been relatively successful in that, as I said, so converting climate and energy system scenarios into policy, but then to build trust in the political decision-making process, through the robustness and through kind of peer-reviewed papers and, as I said, building that trust. And lastly, the real important thing is building absorptive capacity in your policy-making process system. If you've got people who you say X and they hear Y, you know, you can have the best model in the world, but it's not being interpreted right. So having a civil service or stakeholders who can fully understand what you're actually saying is really important. It's really complicated and it's a wicked problem that we're trying to solve. So spending the time to build relationships and having comfortable spaces where they're confidential or not to ask what students would say are stupid questions or basic questions are often the most important questions to ask. So I have 2 minutes left and I'm just going to skim through some examples that we basically got lucky with in Ireland. So we published one of these other papers with a global analysis that I was interested at the time, using a global integrated assessment model, purely looking at what was efficient and fair carbon budgets globally. So this looked at 15 different regions globally. These are sorted, so these are each different regions in a global model, from Africa on the bottom left to the USA in the bottom right. Canada is third from the right. And it's looking at cumulative emissions in yellow. So if we have 3.2 trillion tons globally that'll from post-industrialization to stay below 2 degrees, that's what it would be look like shared out on a per capita basis. This is what's been already consumed. And this is what a 2-degree target would look like. So we, looked at what trading carbon globally would look like, and ultimately worked out at marginal abatement costs curves, depending on how you shared out the carbon budget, what the financial investments would need to be to meet these targets, or to meet these investments. So this was back in 2015. We were already talking about 1.2 trillion. So Paris in 2015, we came to a number of 100 billion. Baku and Azerbaijan came to 300 billion, but we're still far short. But we really looked out just by talking loudly at COP and abusing social media that we had an engagement with the Green Climate Fund, randomly came to Cork to talk to us, and really then had to redistill down that information in ways that they were happy and could understand. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, probably going to go over time by a minute or so, my work at Columbia over the last 3 years. So again, being an engineer, being an energy systems modeler, not particularly comfortable being in the situation room, as they like to call it, at Columbia. The Columbia University is at the top of Central Park, and within the School of International and Public Affairs, often talk about this convening power of Columbia. So bringing together people who don't typically want to talk to each other, very difficult, or just disagreeing with each other. So within the island of Manhattan, we've got 7.8 miles from Columbia downtown to Wall Street. You've got people investing in fossil fuels, obviously, investing in different types of infrastructure, and then you folks in Midtown, different NGOs, environmental NGOs, different types of analysts. So we can really use energy systems models, IPCC type scenarios to disentangle the disagreements, to bring facts and ground truth and have a civil conversation ultimately, so that collectively groups can move forward instead of grinding things to a halt. So the last thing I will say is just to summarize. This is a personal summary. So I think the practice of energy systems modeling, the actual practice of it sitting in front of a computer, rewires and changes how modelers think, how we dream, how we vision, and how we develop intuitions about our future. The insights that we develop, not specifically the scenario numbers or what the real treasure is, what's really important. I love creating mental, rich Sankey diagrams, but they're absolutely bewildering to most policymakers. I'm enjoying reading Yuval Noah Harari's book, Nexus, A Brief History of Information Networks, from the Stone Age to AI, and he talks a lot about this objective realities, which is what we're in the business of, and trying to interpret that into subjective realities, which is what a lot of policymakers do. And so, just to highlight the final point, I think the impactful work that we do is translating our numerical insights into audience-appropriate narratives and stories. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so we start with the discussion now, and yeah, it's nice that in James' last slide he mentions AI, because I want to start building on that and on the nice session we had yesterday. Well, you see that even for this community, some like explaining the AI methodology and this new generation of modeling frameworks that we are going to work with from now on can be very, very, very complex. And I wanted to hear from you guys on your perspectives, how this new generation of modeling frameworks can increase complexity and create challenges or even opportunities, why not, to political acceptance. So either, so I want to hear either like communication challenges or challenges on institutional capacity building or on assessing energy poverty and creating ways to communicate to low-income communities. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to start with. And who would like to start?
I'll jump in.
Okay, good.
Kick the ball off. I have not used AI to try to figure out political acceptability, but what we have used it for in my team at Columbia before I left was making sense of very large data sets. So making sense of global solar capacity, making sense of weather data, and injecting that into US power systems models or global systems models. I think the same understanding of how do you actually communicate those insights, it's still going to be the same method. I wouldn't try to boil down AI insights and equations and try to communicate that to a policymaker, but trying to verbalize the insights as an analyst and as a technical expert would be the first step to go. Yeah, sorry, that's just kicking the ball off. I'm not sure if that helps. Yeah.
Is this working? It's AI is interfering with my... I guess I'm a bit skeptical of AI because it seems like you're putting a black box inside a black box. I mean, the models are sufficiently opaque that, and I think the Energy Modeling Hub is trying to do a good job of kind of unpacking the models and kind of explaining them. But from my understanding, really only the modelers who work with the model understand the model that's really being analyzed. So an AI, I mean, nobody really knows how AI works. It's just that there's some repetition. We're getting some outcomes that make sense, but how it's being arrived at. So I think there's a lot of challenges there for generating public acceptance. You say, well, the AI model said this was the way to decarbonize our economy, and then people are going to be like thinking about Terminator and what could possibly go wrong with this scenario. And I think they might be right. What could go wrong?
Let's jump back in with some other anecdotal overlap between energy systems and AI. I think specifically large language models. I uploaded about 25. Well, I did 2 tests. I uploaded the IEA extended energy balance, which is about 25 gigabytes of data, to Gemini, and I also uploaded a terabyte of data to Gemini and asked it some really specific. Gemini is like Google's ChatGPT, and asked Gemini some very basic questions about what is the percentage of electricity consumption in Ireland coming from renewables in 2018, and I got the answer totally wrong, even though I could get my nephew to do that question really, really easy. So AI and large language models might be interesting for communicating, but they don't currently, as far as I know, grasp numerical complexity very well. That's totally separate from machine learning and regression type AI.
Any other thoughts?
Sure, yeah. So I think there is a gap between, let's say, complex models of the world that we built and understanding that people have to get to political sort of acceptability. But I think what is important is like the more this gap deepens as we use AI in more complex methods, what's important is to make it clear that we focus on the distributional consequences and sort of what the concrete steps to mitigate I'm talking about the labor markets to mitigate transitional costs are essentially, and that's what's going to lead to acceptability, as opposed to understanding of the the backbones of the models.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, maybe just to complete the answer. I mean, AI for sure will help to improve some already existing models in terms of scenariization. We may spend less time to define different scenarios because we can have, for example, reinforcement learning from the inputs and model outputs. So we will actually, AI can help us to define scenarios faster. It may help us to capture uncertainty better. But at the end, it must be transparent, traceable, etc., etc. Yesterday was a wonderful presentation how to check different boxes, because you cannot just give this maybe wonderfully right results to the decision maker and saying, okay, this will be this. But you cannot explain how you obtain it, because with the AI, and the more complex is it, especially with the neural networks and optimization inside the neural networks, it's very difficult to explain. And I think there is a chart for using AI in different projects, and yeah, you must check different boxes in order to be able to communicate and to convince policymakers that these are results not just coming from some black box, but they may be reproduced, and you can understand them and you can interpret them.
Okay, good. So let me pick some questions from Slido. So, okay, do the panelists agree with the notion of winners or losers in the energy transition? And if so, how should policymakers address these dynamics to ensure a just energy transition? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would say in the political science literature over the past 5 years, distributional politics has emerged as the leading explanation for the challenges with climate change. And I think it's good, like especially your work here, and we've seen presented on this panel, kind of get into some of these distributional, the social justice, the economic justice, but it's also sort of been pointing at the domestic politics. The international politics, I think, are still quite important. But I think getting into the weeds of what's going on within the countries in terms of the distribution, the winners and losers, it's going to be very, very important. So our area is very important, and more work in that area needs to be done.
I don't like personally the definition of winners and losers. If we will not talk about, for example, climate impact on some poor countries, let's focus on Canada and impact on different stakeholders. For instance, for example, conventional energy production companies based on the fossil fuels versus like a new coming on renewables. I think energy transition must be considered as an enabler and something more as an incentive than a limitation. I think that the most stable, there was a wonderful commercial, I think it was for the cars actually, that I think the stability is the movement. So actually you must always move and evolve. So basically the diversification of the business, I think it's something that everybody must consider, and the conventional company will eventually diversify, and this will help. This is adapt better to the context, etc., etc. So I'm looking on it more as an enabler. We can draw the parallel, for example, with some other, let's say, limitations. For example, in land scarcity, in Singapore, a very small country. So they are losing in terms of available resources. But this pushes them to innovate faster and deeper, and to have a very close connection between the researcher and the decision maker. The implementation of a research concept is quite fast. So, I think we must more consider it as some sort of enabler, and the movement and adaptation of different stakeholders is important. And obviously for the vulnerable stakeholders, we talked about poor households, there must be some customized support measures to not leave them behind.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, I'm not sure if there are going to be eventually winners and losers, but I know that this is something that we should be conscious about, both within sort of countries like Germany or countries in North America, with what happens with workers along the distribution of the skill level, let's say, but also between countries. Let's say the global north-south, maybe displacement effects of environmental regulations and so on. These are both dimensions that we should be conscious of.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree with that. Okay, so there is one question here. I think it fits more to Mark, but I'm sure that other panelists can give some interesting insights as well. So, is the current gap in effective decision making due to a lack of modeling capacity, or is it more about insufficient capacity among policymakers to effectively use and interpret models? And adding a bit to that, if there is, I would be interested to learn if there is any insights on building institutional capacity based on your research. So,
okay, that's a great question, a big question. I guess what I would just say is that there's a real gap in the literature on decision making and political science. Political scientists aren't really so excited about models, if you can believe it. So myself, Mark Winfield, there's a handful of us who've been looking at models and how they're being used, but there's a real gap. So we don't really know that much about how models are being used in decision making. Like the empirical research, I don't think exists. But there are reasons to suspect that models don't really have that much impact on decision making, in the sense that my presentation on the situation in California is actually very unique. You have a whole institutional legal process set up that requires these models to be used. And that, I mean, imagine if we had that for, greenhouse gas emission targets in Canada or US or wherever. I mean, it would be, the model says we need to do this. Okay, well, let's develop a plan. We don't really see that happening, I don't think. Maybe there's some cases out there where it's approximated. But there's also, I think most decision makers probably aren't so interested in models. They're probably not so aware of models. I think that's increasing because modeling is starting to take more and more space in decision making and in the policy process, these discussions like we're having here. But my assumption is that, and this would be something to talk about and do more research and hear from others on the panel about, is it's not clear what role models are actually playing in decision making. And maybe that's where I'll stop.
I'll jump in. Controversially, there's quite a good bit of literature on decision making in the energy sphere, internationally at least, using models. And in other decision-making processes, like in military. So using game theory in trying to have different types of, the traditional blue team, red team in the US is a good example of using game type models to scenario envision catastrophes and then prepare for those worst case scenarios like the US military do. And the US Army certainly use energy systems models and climate models to explore scenarios. They've got some public literature and they've definitely got some private literature on it internally. In Ireland and the UK, there's secondments directly from government civil servants into research labs in academia. So I know like the British government, they used to be called BEIS, it was BEIS, I'm not sure what they're called under the new Labour government, but there's a rotating door between UCL, University College London, the modelling team there, and multiple government officials there. The BEIS in the UK have verified the Times Code literally line by line and validated it because legally they needed to do that to make decisions to then legislate from time scenarios that are now in law in the UK. And there's a smaller, similar type of interaction in the Irish government. So I think Ireland and the UK are the only places that have legislated for carbon budgets and different types of trajectories based on those types of on energy systems models. And then more broadly, actually, I should correct myself that the PRIMES model in the European Commission has a long history of using and legislating for policy in different European Commission directives using those models. So there's different examples, good and bad, of models and numbers definitely specifically from those models being injected into policies, into financial standards in central banks, in Department of Finance and Treasury, discount rates, those kind of things. There's quite a bit of examples internationally. Within Canada, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks for sharing the experience. So yeah, let me give the space for the audience. So please.
Mark Winfield, York University. First, I want to thank Elisaveta for raising the distributional justice question, because we haven't heard anything about them so far. And also for raising the questions of agency and capacity at the lower end of the income scale. Because again, we've been overlooking this, that a lot of people at the lower end of the income scale do not have either control or the financial or informational ability to make choices about their energy consumption. And that's huge, and we tend to overlook this a lot. So that's just a big thank you for that one, that we finally got those questions on the table. My more specific question, though, and this is one we can talk about later on, but I did wonder, though, you're making assumptions about what these trajectories actually look like and how they play out. And I did kind of wonder, at least in an Ontario context, and given where the government is actually gone on this, that if electricity costs are going to double, potentially, and your biggest expense is going to become for space heating, even if you've got a heat pump, because like somebody forgot to give the memo about efficiency of the heat pump that they installed in our house. Isn't that going to cause people potentially to pull back from going electric on space heating and staying with gas, which would then sort of change the trajectory in terms of what happens with gas costs? Will keep them down. And I'm also very conscious that Enbridge has already figured this one out, that unless you cut the cord completely with the gas grid, they've embedded costs into the system to make sure that they can continue to maintain the grid. So unless people are going full electrification, including hot water and everything else, that connection is likely to stay. So I'm just putting that out there in terms of how the trajectories might play out here in this particular case, and whether you may get some. We're already seeing some resistance and indeed political pressure to expand the gas grid, precisely because it is seen as the cheaper space heating option.
Thank you, Mark. So basically here we can see some maybe limitation of the model and the potential opportunity for further coupling, because how all these trajectories are projected. It's usually the least cost for the entire society. The model will not look into reallocation of costs, how the utility will do it, and the increase of specific tariffs. It will just deploy what is least cost and satisfy some specific policy constraints, for instance, the emissions from various sectors. So the trajectory are projected like this, and then we use another model which we plug in to see what will be impact on rates. And yes, so basically what we need theoretically to do is to have the backup loop or somehow refine the model that will consider not only the total cost for society, but also cost for the individual stakeholders. Because indeed the adoption of electric heating systems or other technologies may be limited, and the gas prices will not increase as much. I mean, they will not increase as much as we showed, because there will be always regulators saying, no, you must respect some maximum threshold for increase. Actually, this is quite a complex dynamic. We may look, for the last EMH, we presented some work with the agent-based modeling, basically the reaction of individual households on the increase in rates and for their adoption of distributed generation. But I think there is a room maybe for more deeper exploration of using agent-based modeling and the reaction of increasing rates of how they will actually switch or not from one fuel to another. And this will send back a signal to the utility that will actually, the increase in different rates may be different. We have actually a project on this submitted for AI. We are waiting for the decision, but the goal is to have a multi-layer agent-based system where we have a utility, some regulator supervising this, and a lot of residential consumers, and to study all this dynamic and how it will impact actually the rates, and sending back the signals to consumers to see what they will be the reaction and so on. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
So we think James wants to jump in quickly.
Yeah,
Out of time.
I'll be very quick, and just so anecdotally, I think it's important to think about the gentleman's question. Is it the cost or the price of electricity bills going up? So anecdotally, yes, of course, the gross amount of electricity that you're paying for is going up. Whether the time of day price is going up, that's debatable. But really what I think at the end of the day is important is the cost of the household energy service bill going up. So of course, if we're electrifying, we're going to be spending more money on electricity, but that's going to substitute away from gasoline. It's going for your car, and it's going to substitute away from whatever you're using for home heating oil. So at least in the Irish case, yes, we're going to spend more on a household level for electricity, but the household budget for energy as a whole, energy services, mobility, lighting, heating, and electricity is reduced within our scenarios, at least.
Okay, so do we end it, or do we have time for one more? Yeah, we are 3 minutes over time. Okay, so thank you everyone. Thank you for the panel.
That's fine. I'm for the clock equity here. So for all the other panelists. So thank you so much. I will be very brief. You can leave if you want. I'll do the final remarks. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you for the whole panel. Well, it's already the end. It's been 2 full days of exciting presentation. I want to thank all the guests, all the presenter, all the chair for their engagement and contribution. I hope you like it. Maybe let's give a round of applause to everybody for those 2 days. So basically, please stay tuned and visit our website, follow us on LinkedIn to follow our activities and subscribe to our newsletters. Early next year, we'll be opening a next call for multi-model comparison forum. Of course, there'll be some call for application to join the technical advisory committee as well. So if you're interested, there's plenty of opportunity to engage with us. If you are interested to know more about the M3 platform and the work that was presented by the team today, coders, M3 idea, again, engage with us. We are always looking for collaborators. I hope those today provided a lot of information to get back to your regular job, and I'm grateful that you spent those today with us. Personally, I found there's a lot of challenge that was raised as well, but rest assured, we're here to try to tackle some of them, and we'll be sharing some of the insights in the event to come, of course. Before we close, I would like to thank you, our co-host Irina, for their participation. Thank you, Larissa and the team. We hope to have you with us next year again. Again, a big thanks to NRCan for funding our activities and to all our sponsors. Once again, Institut l'Énergie Trottier, our platinum sponsor, Toronto Hydro, ISMIA Consultant, Sotubra Research, our silver sponsors, Dunsky Energy, Climate Advisor, and Navius Research for sponsoring lunch and meals, and AltaLink and the Canadian Centre for Energy Information for supporting the exhibition. A big thank to my small but very engaged team. You've engaged with some of them in the past 2 days, so Yalda Sadi, Alexandre Augustin, Bipasa Agrawal, Anna Famed, and Pierre Silpa. And of course, my thanks to the EMH Advisory Board. They've been more than present, so Professor Normand Mousseau, Associate Professor Madeleine McPherson, Associate Professor Blake Schaefer, Professor Mark Winfield, and Mr. Louis Baumier from Institut l'Énergie Trottier. Special thanks to Alana Müller. Some of you have engaged with her before the conference and during the last 2 days. She provides a lot of support, and she saved my life many times in the last couple of weeks. And thanks again for your contribution. We'll be posting the presentation and the report online. And well, safe travels home and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you, guys.